Good evening. My name is Susan Pavati. I'm a principal with BFJ Planning, and I'm here with my colleague Noah Levine, an associate principal at BFJ. And we're really excited to present to you tonight the Jersey City Master Plan Land Use Element. This is an almost 2-year process that we've undertaken with the city, and we're going to spend time tonight telling you about many of its recommendations and the process itself. And we hope that the planning board will adopt the document this evening. So I'm going to get started on presentation. And basically, we're going to provide an overview of the land use element itself, as well as the process for the planning. We're going to give you the guiding principles that are part of the land use element, as well as a general overview of its larger recommendations. And the element also included a process of a small area vision planning for specific neighborhoods in the city, and we're going to take you through those. And then finally, we'll open it up for discussion and questions from the board and the public. Okay. So in terms of the process for the land use element, this was part of a larger planning process, which you heard about earlier in the evening. The master plan vision document, our Jersey City. Our element was a piece of that process and closely coordinated with the vision team, as well as the open space element team. We worked under the Department of Housing, Economic Development and Commerce and the Division of City Planning. And our project manager on this was Liz Opper from the city. On the consultants side, BFJ Planning was the lead firm. Myself as principal in charge and Noah here tonight. We also had several other folks on our team. And we had sub-consultants, FHI Studio, who led the small area vision planning effort, Mud Workshop focused on urban design, which you'll hear about later in the evening. And then RES Group looked specifically at issues of development in real estate. We worked closely with 2 steering committees who helped guide the process and testing out recommendations and issues that we heard about throughout the process. We had a technical advisory committee, which included a number of stakeholders with very specific technical expertise across a range of areas. And we met also, on the next slide, you'll see with the city council members representing the different wards of the city, as well as the city as a whole, and their representatives of the community. For both of these committees, we met regularly during the process, and they were instrumental in giving us feedback and the development of the plan. And now I'm going to turn it to Noah to spend a few minutes about the overall planning process.
Thanks, Susan. As you can see in the schedule on this slide, the planning process was roughly about 1.5 years. We began in March 2020, just before COVID-19. But what this schedule shows is the sequence of various deliverables and public outreach activities as they were completed. The first phase began with our analysis of existing conditions, which we completed at the end of 2020. During that time, we also conducted a number of outreach activities. We started to develop draft recommendations in the winter and spring of 2021, and that was concurrent with the development of the small area vision plans. And in the summer, we submitted draft plans to the city, which were provided online and commented on, and we're here to present our final recommendations. Our plan included a number of opportunities for public engagement. In the beginning, we had a neighborhood needs survey, which really helped to outline some of the initial issues and opportunities that we should look at, and it pointed us in the right direction. We also had a variety of online public workshops. We shifted more to an online engagement strategy due to the impact of COVID-19. But in the early stages of the process, we did have an in-person public workshop. We did a number of other surveys, including merchant surveys. We did interviews with developers. We had a series of focus group meetings organized around various topic areas, as well as charrettes as part of the small area vision plan process. I just wanted to give you an outline of what is included in the land use element. This slide just shows the table of contents. After the introduction, we have the community profile, which explains a lot of the issues and trends that have occurred since the prior plan was done in 2000. Existing land use and zoning chapter lays the foundation of what is there now and what zoning exists today. The land use principles, which I'm going to go into on subsequent slides, provides a framework for goals and recommendations that were provided later in the report. The urban design framework was completed by MUD Workshop and looks at areas in the city that share commonalities and looks at strategies to improve those areas based on various typologies. And lastly, the land use and zoning recommendations, which Susan will go over later in this presentation, provides detailed recommendations both for land use zoning as well as policy and programmatic changes. The last chapter, the Small Area Vision Plan, done by FHI, looks at specific neighborhood plans and improvements that could be done in those areas. The summary in the land use element is really just an executive summary. The full plans can be found in the appendix, Appendix A. Appendix B provides supplementary zoning information as well as detailed information on each redevelopment plan, as well as the Climate Action and Energy Plan, which was developed by the city and hopefully will be adopted as part of this land use element. Now I'm going to discuss some of the land use principles. Based on our extensive analysis of existing conditions, input from the public, stakeholders and city staff, a number of key principles emerged that guide the overall land use approach. These principles, detailed in Chapter 3, provide the policy foundation for land use and zoning recommendations, as well as for policy and program changes. The foundational core for each of these principles can be found in the 4 lenses identified in our JC Master Plan vision: connectivity and mobility, economic opportunity, social equity, and climate resiliency. While the lenses are used as the organizing framework for the larger vision document, they also guide the overall approach and specific recommendations in this land use element. In upcoming slides, I will briefly go through the land use element's guiding principles. The first 2 principles focus on the need to enhance residential neighborhoods and also ensure that the city's housing supply is balanced and meets the needs of residents. While Jersey City's skyline is marked by dense, high-rise development, most of its residential neighborhoods exist at a much lower scale. 1 and 2 unit housing, typically in the R1 district, is the largest and most prevalent land use in the city. Many of these areas haven't seen a significant amount of reinvestment despite the rapid growth happening elsewhere in the city. Many of these areas have unique urban design challenges, such as how buildings address parking, as well as how they can retain an attractive streetscape. The policies point to recommendations that will help to stabilize and upgrade neighborhoods such as Bergen-Lafayette, Greenville, and the Heights by promoting rehabilitation of substandard units, infill development of diverse housing types, and inclusion of neighborhood-oriented commercial uses where appropriate to ensure that all residents are within walking distance to goods and services. Housing affordability has become a major issue as real estate values have been rising in the city and the region. The city should adjust policies and zoning to provide for more diversity in housing options. This could be done through policies that require affordable housing, but also by allowing for increased densities and accessory dwelling units in specific areas. The next 2 slides talk about the need to make Jersey City a more walkable community filled with neighborhoods that have everything they need within a 15-minute walk. The need for all residents to have convenient access to neighborhood commercial amenities was a consistent theme that emerged from the public outreach. Residents expressed support for a wider diversity in businesses within their own neighborhoods, especially small business options. There was significant interest in providing for more food options. Providing neighborhood retail and services within walking distance of all residents will strengthen vitality and provide options for different types and scales of businesses. This element looks at ways to improve the health of commercially zoned corridors, including where commercial activities should be strengthened and occasionally where it should be limited to core areas. The element also identifies ways for businesses to reconnect with the streetscape and promote street activity. With regard to transportation, while some areas have excellent public transit access, residents in many neighborhoods still use cars to access jobs, goods, and services. There remains the need for more convenient options for non-vehicular transportation throughout the city. Many commercial areas are heavily biased towards the automobile, making them less safe for pedestrians and bicyclists, and unattractive for residents and visitors. Even many of the neighborhood-oriented commercial corridors could be more inviting. The zoning approach for many of the commercial corridors considered ways to make these roads more friendly. The zoning looks at areas that could support some additional densities to create walkable nodes, such as near light rail stations and neighborhood commercial centers. These three principles address the need to ensure that Jersey City's growth is economically sustainable. During focus group meetings and other public outreach events, representatives from the business and development communities expressed that the city could do more to drive local economic activity, increase employment, strengthen the tax base, and protect against cyclical downturns. The city should continue to employ strategies that will track businesses through clear, predictable, and transparent regulations, procedures, and timelines. The city acknowledges that there is a need to retain a diversity of commercial and industrial uses. Most job growth in the past 20 years has been at the high end of the income scale. There is a need for jobs oriented to the full spectrum of income levels, so more residents can live and work within the city. The city should encourage adaptive reuse of obsolete buildings, especially industrial facilities, for uses that include commercial and/or industrial activities, not just residential. The element promotes adaptive reuse opportunities and other zoning approaches to protect and support the incubation of small businesses, arts, urban manufacturing, makerspace offices, and other clean industries. The retail environment in Jersey City and the country as a whole has shifted in recent years. The rise in internet shopping has resulted in a decline in traditional brick and mortar sales nationwide. This impact is being felt in the city's large format commercial areas, which tend to be auto-oriented with large, underutilized parking areas. Jersey City can help to ensure that vulnerable large format retail areas are in a good position to adapt by creating a flexible regulatory environment. Flexibility is also needed in the office market. COVID-19 has resulted in a dramatic shift in demand for office uses. While it's impossible to predict how the market will evolve, the city should consider allowing for some flexibility to allow office spaces to adapt. Some of the older office buildings may be appropriate for conversion to residential with affordable housing. Other potential uses include hospitality, medical offices, co-working, light manufacturing, and commercial kitchens. These policies address the need to improve community facilities and public facilities throughout the city. The public realm includes streets, sidewalks, and public spaces, most of which are publicly owned. Therefore, the city has more agency in generating change. The streetscape along some of the city's neighborhood-oriented commercial corridors is in need of improvements to make them more walkable and welcoming for shopping and dining. Additionally, many of the city's major auto-oriented commercial corridors need aesthetic improvements. COVID-19 has also forced many cities to rethink public spaces, including creative approaches to encourage business activity on sidewalks and streets. In addition, more can be done to identify and strengthen gateways into the city as well as into individual neighborhoods. Jersey City's public realm also provides an opportunity to celebrate the diversity of its residents and the richness of its arts and cultural offerings. Public art and historic markers can serve a dual purpose of beautifying the streetscape and public spaces while also educating residents and visitors alike about the city's diverse heritage. The land use element also supports policies from the open space and public facilities element. For example, the city should link existing parks and open space assets to form interconnected greenways that provide connectivity to neighborhoods, public facilities, and employment areas. This network should include public access along both the Hudson and Hackensack rivers. The city should also look to reuse legacy infrastructure such as the Bergen Arches, 6th Street Embankment, and Morris Canal for greenways. In the years since the 2000 master plan, commitment to sustainable planning has taken a more prominent stage. This reflects several factors, including more development pressure on a diminishing supply of land and greater awareness of the environmental impacts of human activities. Reducing flood risk remains as one of the city's most pressing needs. The land use element incorporated recommendations from prior plans such as the Climate Action Plan, Resiliency and Adaptation Master Plans, Urban Environmental Green Infrastructure Design Plan, as well as adoption of the Flood-Prone Overlay District. The city should also continue to further recommendations of the Climate Action Plan by facilitating sustainable development policies that minimize waste and energy use, both for private developers and at city-owned facilities. Second policy addresses facilities such as parks, schools, community centers, and emergency services. Specific recommendations are provided in the open space and public facilities element. In general, there's a need to provide a balance of citywide community facilities that are accessible from every neighborhood. There's also a need to upgrade community facilities, particularly in underserved areas and those that are rapidly growing. Land use policies also seek to accommodate and capitalize on the growth of the city's colleges and universities, museums, and other cultural and educational uses. Jersey City's historical development has contributed to a dense and complex urban fabric where land use densities, access to resources, and socioeconomic conditions can vary from one neighborhood to the next. In order to touch upon all areas of the city, the land use element addresses issues at the citywide, mid-level, and local scales. The citywide scale looks at conditions that occur throughout the city and should be addressed through comprehensive zoning changes and capital improvements. The mid-scale recognizes that some of the issues occur in multiple areas of the city based on different types of development patterns. The urban design framework, largely created by Mud Workshop, which is in Chapter 4, identifies many of the commonalities and presents recommendations based on development type. Finally, at the local scale, this planning process included the development of 3 small area vision plans for specific geographic areas. These plans address community concerns and provide an opportunity to demonstrate how citywide recommendations can be implemented at the neighborhood level. In this way, these neighborhood plans serve as templates for how to implement the land use element across the city and serve as a model for the creation of neighborhood plans. And now I'm going to pass it to Susan to provide an overview of recommendations within the land use element.
Thank you, Noah. We're going to take you through the wide range of recommendations in the land use element. It is an extensive document and includes many, many recommendations. So we're not going to go through every single one in detail, but we hope the planning board has been able to review the document and we know that there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end as well. So on the next slide, we'll get started with the urban design framework, which again, as Noah mentioned, it's looking at the mid-scale environment. The urban design framework examines Jersey City's built environment and classifies it into a number of categories or development patterns according to how people experience and navigate the city. This includes not only the buildings, but also the public realm. For example, the street right-of-way, public plazas, transportation infrastructure, waterfronts, and the in-between or leftover spaces. This analysis identified 10 major types of development patterns to guide recommendations that speak to the master plan lenses, as well as the land use principles that Noah just spoke about, but that are tailored to the specific built environment for these areas. They're loosely defined areas of the city that may have comparable land use patterns and can thus be addressed in similar ways, even if they are in different neighborhoods. Of these development patterns, the 5 highlighted are ones that received more in-depth analysis because they were determined to be experiencing significant land use issues that need to be addressed, and because they best advance the community's near-term priorities, as well as the master plan vision. And we'll be discussing these in more detail in the upcoming slides. In looking at which development patterns to explore in more detail and what recommendations might be appropriate for them, the project team examined another number of interrelated factors. We looked at the relationship between transit and population density, and also which areas of the city are particularly vulnerable to climate change. We also looked at where neighborhoods are experiencing rapid growth and what that means in terms of community facilities and amenities. And finally, we found that there are portions of Jersey City where lower income residents often have less access to neighborhood goods and services, which raises concerns about equity. And on the next slide, we'll get started on those development patterns that are highlighted in the previous slides. And the first one is low density residential areas, which, as Noah mentioned, really occupies a very significant area of land in Jersey City. In fact, the majority of the city is characterized by low density residential neighborhoods like Greenville, the West Side, and the Heights, which generally correspond to the R1 zoning district. The built environment here tends to be auto-oriented and is shown in these photos dominated by off-street parking infrastructure. We also found in our analysis that there are frequent variance requests and density violations in the R1 district, which indicates a market demand for different types of housing than the district may allow. And finally, the R1 zone is largely a 1- and 2-family residential district, with a lack of opportunities for neighborhood businesses within walking distance. So on the next slide, you'll see some strategies that the land use element identifies for low density residential areas and some key issues. And the land use element spends a lot of time analyzing and talking about this R1 district because it is so significant in the city, and looks at ways to make the design of sites in the zone less focused on the car and more on the pedestrian and the streetscape. Many of the land use element's recommendations deal with parking, limiting the amount of off-street parking and reducing curb cuts, especially on narrow lots, to improve pedestrian safety and try to reclaim more area for landscaping. There are also recommendations that speak to supporting a broader range of housing types, including small apartment buildings that are compatible with the overall density and scale of the neighborhoods. Many of these types of buildings already exist and predate the current zoning. On the next slide, looking at residential neighborhoods across the city, there are a number of recommendations in the land use element that speak to these areas. There are a series of recommended map changes that essentially would reflect what actually exists already on the ground, whether it's multifamily or mixed use corridors that doesn't actually conform to the current zoning. We also suggest implementing standard bulk requirements regardless of use in residential districts. This will help to streamline the ordinance and also recognize that a building's uses can change over time. And we know that in some neighborhoods, their buildings have detached garages or carriage houses, and these could be converted to accessory dwelling units to broaden affordable housing opportunities. So going back to the R1 district, there are a number of recommendations that really pertain specifically to the R1. One of these is considering allowing 3-unit dwellings as a conditional use at a relative density comparable to the existing housing stock. Additional density could also be considered to promote rehabilitation or restoration of historic buildings. And where there are front-facing garages, we recommend looking at allowing small businesses to occupy these areas, both to increase access to neighborhood goods and services and to activate the street front. Similarly, the land use element recommends allowing small-scale restaurants at corners and along two-way streets in the R1 district. And both of these recommendations really speak to the concept of the 15-minute city that Noah discussed earlier, where more residents can walk to local businesses and be less dependent on a car. The land use element also notes that there are pockets of a historic building typology found in key areas of the R1 district that's characterized by 2 stories with a cellar and a raised stoop. It's a very unique building type, and the land use element recommends exploring zoning overlay approaches to preserve these areas and protect them from demolition. On the next slide, we talk specifically about parking in the R1 district. And the land use element recommends changes to bulk and parking regulations that would effectively restrict curb cuts to narrower lots that are less than 50 feet wide. We believe this could be effective in discouraging many curb cuts as well as building demolitions. And the reduction in curb cuts should also allow for better enforcement of existing prohibitions on parking in the front yard. It's something that currently is not allowed, but it's something that we see throughout the R1 neighborhoods. The land use element also suggests taking a more nuanced approach to parking requirements in the R1 zone that reflects the bedroom mix rather than the total number of units. So the next development pattern that we'll discuss is regional corridors. And these types of roads, which are shown in red on the map, are characterized by high-speed traffic and a limited focus on bikes and pedestrians. The land uses here tend to be low-rise and auto-oriented. They're reinforced by bulk standards that promote things like drive-through, large parking lots, and large front yard setbacks. On the next slide, we get into some of the recommendations that the urban design framework focuses on. The framework looks at opportunities for targeted density increases that are focused on key intersections while maintaining the scale of adjacent neighborhoods. Additional density could also be considered to achieve community amenities and affordable housing, while changes to bulk standards could create a more pedestrian-friendly environment that can significantly change the character of these corridors over time. On the next slide, we talk about another type of commercial area, what we call gateway corridors. And the land use element recommends that the city can consider creating a new zoning district for several of these corridors that are entry points into the city and are heavily used by commuters and residents alike. These corridors are characterized by auto-related uses like repair shops and car washes, which are definitely necessary uses for the community. But we do think that there are opportunities to improve the design of these areas to be more pedestrian friendly and to limit impacts on nearby neighborhoods. You can see on the map several of these areas highlighted. They include Communipaw Avenue, portions of Communipaw Avenue, as well as portions of Route 139 and the southern end of Kennedy Boulevard. Moving on to waterfront areas, looking at the waterfront planning district in particular, this is found on Route 440, which is a corridor that is changing significantly with the upcoming Bayfront development, as well as development around New Jersey City University. And there are long-term plans to transition Route 440 into a boulevard with more pedestrian amenities. We found in the land use element process that the WPD district really is not consistent with that future vision. And so major changes are needed to that district to better align with that long-term plan and to create public access to the Hackensack River waterfront. We also suggest pulling in the highway commercial area, which is shown on the map just south of Communipaw Avenue, merging that into the WP district for a more cohesive approach. On the next slide, we look at Tunnelly Avenue, which is currently zoned for highway commercial. And this zoning district provides for large format retail uses with significant yards to allow for surface parking and a maximum height of 6 stories. But that's not actually what exists on Tunnelly Avenue. And so the land use element suggests that this area be rezoned to commercial automotive, which is a better fit both in terms of bulk and the allowable uses. There are some changes that may be needed to the CA zone to accommodate the existing hotels on the Tunnelly Avenue corridor. On the next slide, we look at neighborhood centers, which is another development pattern that the urban design framework looks at. And these are neighborhoods that are typically fairly well defined in the city, and they often contain a wide mix of local businesses. Some of these neighborhood centers are also supported by special improvement districts. But what we heard from the local business community and throughout the public engagement process is that neighborhood centers tend to lack a critical mass that can really support a vibrant neighborhood business community. And many of these areas do remain focused on the automobile with limited pedestrian access from nearby neighborhoods that could really be strengthened. So on the next slide, we look at some of the key strategies for the neighborhood centers. And they really center on looking at bulk strategies and new zoning that supports density at a range of scales that are appropriate to the surrounding area, but that start to create that critical mass to support more local businesses. They also look at using bulk standards to incentivize improvements on the public realm. So on this slide, you see that there are 3 scales that the land use element identifies for neighborhood centers that would be reinforced through new zoning. On the small end of the scale, there's a scale that looks at 5 stories, a mixed use context, and you see that identified for several areas throughout the city. In the medium scale for neighborhood centers, that would be 6 to 8 stories, either in a mixed use or all commercial building context. And these are found or located at West Side Avenue, portions of West Side Avenue, as well as portions of Newark Avenue and the Five Corners area, also on Newark Avenue. At the larger end, the large scale neighborhood center, this would be 8 to 12 stories in a variety of formats. And this is identified for 2 specific areas of the city, McGinley Square and the periphery of the Journal Square area. Okay, the next development pattern is transit nodes, really focused on the light rail stations that are outside the downtown core, typically in the southern part of the city, that lack the population density and strong access to the transit node that would support higher ridership for these stations. These stations are clearly major assets for their neighborhoods, but they need to be better connected into the neighborhood, including with greater amenities so that they are more usable by the community. So in terms of recommendations for transit nodes, there are a range of strategies to strengthen these station areas, including supporting targeted density increases, allowing more or providing more amenities around the station and the areas themselves, and improving access to other modes of transportation, such as the pedestrian network, the sidewalk network, bike infrastructure, and micro-mobility like the VIA system. On the next slide, we talk about regulations, the future zoning of these transit nodes. It's a very similar approach to that taken by the neighborhood centers. There are 3 scales of development shown that would be supported by changes in zoning. At the small end, that very similar scale to the neighborhood centers. It's a 5-story mixed use context. And you see that recommended for Congress Street and Garfield Avenue. On the mid scale, the medium density, it would be 6 to 8 stories. And that's really recommended around the Martin Luther King Avenue station as well as West Side Avenue. And then in the southern portion of the city, the two stations at Danforth Avenue and Richard Street, this would be a more limited density comparable to the R2D or R5 zoning district, which already exists in the city. And it's important to note that for these transit nodes, none of these areas were determined to be appropriate for the larger scale development that you saw in some of the neighborhood centers. So transitioning to large format retail, which you heard a bit about earlier, there are several areas of Jersey City that are characterized by large scale malls, either indoor or outdoor malls, as well as large scale single tenant big box stores. And these places are clearly important in providing goods and services as well as jobs for Jersey City residents and nearby communities. But with major shifts in the retail environment driven by the explosion of online retail and accelerated by the COVID pandemic, it can be expected that owners of these properties may want to explore new development options. So this creates an opportunity to correct some of the urban design issues that these areas present, such as cutting off waterfront areas, breaking up the street grid, and lacking in pedestrian and bike infrastructure. So the urban design framework and the land use element overall both have a range of recommendations for large format retail. The framework recommends strategies in the event of future development of these areas that should be used. On the next slide, you'll see that this includes reestablishing the street grid, reorienting development to the pedestrian and the street, broadening the range of allowable uses, and reducing impervious coverage. And it's important to note that these areas are private property and the city cannot compel new development to occur. However, the land use element recommends working collaboratively with the property owners on their future plans to ensure that if and when changes do happen, they leverage the opportunity to improve the built environment, as illustrated in the land use element. Moving on to the next slide, looking broadly at commercial and industrial areas throughout the city, the land use element talks about adding more flexibility to accommodate many new uses that the market may shift and demand for. This includes some of the uses that you see on the screen: commercial agriculture, business incubators, small scale manufacturing, medical labs, and commercial kitchens, which you heard about earlier. Also allowing more than one use in a single space, and overall supporting green and job creating industrial uses that can really speak to the market that is in place today. Looking at institutional and open space areas, the land use element recommends rezoning some key assets in the city to the Parks and Open Space Zone. This includes the Bergen Arches and the 6th Street embankment. The element also recommends expanding the potential uses in the PO district to allow for more community amenities such as food options. The land use element also talks about institutional districts and recommends working with higher learning institutions on their long-term planning to ensure that they can continue to grow while knitting their facilities better into the neighborhoods. And it's recommended that the city explore an overlay zoning approach, particularly for St. Peter's, that could provide the school with more flexibility while respecting the local context. The next section of the land use element talks about historic districts and areas, and there are 3 areas of the city where there are recommended new local historic districts. The first is Bergen Hill, just north of the Junction neighborhood, Communipal Lafayette, which is a little bit west of Liberty State Park, as well as an area along Sherman Place in the Heights, which would be designated the Hudson City Historic District. In addition, the land use element recommends cleaning up some of the existing boundaries of historic districts, as well as the underlying zoning, ensuring compatible infill development, and updating the historic preservation element. And then the next slide, you'll see that there are a number of other recommendations that the land use element explores. The first is dealing with parking and curbside management. The city completed a parking plan in 2020, and it includes many recommendations that can be implemented and that the land use element supports. This includes rationalizing parking ratios across zoning districts and redevelopment areas, and improving the efficiency of off-street parking overall. The land use element also speaks to managing curb cuts and curbside management. This is an issue that really came into focus during the pandemic, when we saw great demand for drop-off and pickup. And the land use element recommends approaching this through a balance of pedestrian safety and the availability of on-street parking, while acknowledging the needs for drop-off and loading areas. Moving on to the next slide, there have been a number of measures taken by the city to enhance sustainability and resiliency to climate change, building off of many prior efforts, including the Climate and Energy Action Plan. And the city has been quite active in implementing many of these recommendations, such as allowing for more electric vehicle charging stations, as you see on the map on the right, which shows city-owned EV charging stations. Other recommendations in the land use element also include support for inclusionary housing and other affordability measures throughout the city. This was something that came out strongly in the community engagement as part of this process, as well as improving signage, design of signage and gateways, and implementing cannabis business regulations, which were recently adopted by the city. And finally, the land use element does include a number of sort of cleanup recommendations. There are opportunities to clarify and streamline both the zoning map and the text so that it's more user-friendly and up-to-date. And you'll see that there are very detailed maps in the land use element that identify many of these changes. The final piece of the land use element speaks to redevelopment planning, which is a very significant aspect of Jersey City's land use and development. And it's been a major tool in the city's development for decades. It's propelled major revitalization initiatives that have transformed large areas of the city. However, with almost 100 individual redevelopment plan areas that cover roughly half of the land area of Jersey City, we find that a heavy reliance on redevelopment has tended to create a hodgepodge of land use. And some of the issues that creates include jarring transitions to adjoining neighborhoods, and an overall lack of predictability on the scale of development and its impacts on infrastructure. So looking forward, the land use element suggests that the city takes a more intentional approach to redevelopment that focuses on how redevelopment designation can be used to achieve benefits the community needs, such as open space and transit improvements. The plan also identifies which redevelopment plan areas are ripe for transition to traditional or straight zoning, which areas should be revisited or changed, and which should remain in place as redevelopment proceeds. And you see that in the map on the right. The areas in gray are basically recommended to remain in place. Areas in green may be ripe for transitioning to traditional zoning, and then there are other areas identified for changes. Additional recommendations on the next slide regarding redevelopment include 2 new potential redevelopment plan areas. These are the Hudson County Office Complex located on Montgomery Street, and also the 6th Street embankment. And then there are also recommendations for some updates to specific redevelopment plan areas, including 2 of which came directly out of the small area vision planning, which we'll speak about in a minute. Okay. And then the maps that you see on this page, which I'm not going to go through one by one, but they summarize many of the recommendations on map changes that address recommendations we've been speaking about, including removing remnant zoning, creating new zones to strengthen neighborhood centers and transit nodes, and changing residential zoning to reflect the existing mixed use on the ground. And on the next slide, we'll just discuss briefly, there is an implementation matrix in the land use element that summarizes all the recommendations of the plan in one place, which we hope makes it easy for the city to track over time and really forms a to-do list for the city to help with their implementation efforts. Okay, so now I'm going to transition to the small area vision plans, which again were prepared by FHI Studio and involved a sort of separate process, which was part of the land use element, but also a separate process on its own. And these are community-driven plans for 3 specific areas of the city. These areas were selected because they exhibit issues that were identified as priorities in the citywide neighborhood needs study. They're areas that have not typically received much planning attention, and they also show diversity in terms of demographics and geography. As Noah mentioned earlier, the small area vision plans present an opportunity to test citywide recommendations at the local scale, but they also identify detailed strategies that respond to concerns raised by the individual communities and advance their priorities. And on the next slide, you'll see where these areas are. There are, again, 3 areas: West Side Avenue, the Junction, and Lower Heights. And for each area, a plan was developed that includes a range of recommendations, including regulations, which could be zoning or design guidelines, public or capital improvements, or programs and policies. And because of the COVID pandemic, all of the engagement for the small area vision plans was done virtually. but it included a robust process for each area to reach interested residents and stakeholders and involve them closely in the planning process. And moving to the next slide, we'll discuss a little bit more in detail on the engagement. It occurred on multiple levels. First, there was an on-demand workshop, which gave participants the opportunity to engage at their own time and convenience in ongoing online activities. For each small area, we asked people to identify their priority areas of concern, their big ideas, what they want to see either change or be preserved, and what types of building scale they think is appropriate for their neighborhood. In addition, we also hosted 2 online workshops for each small area. The first workshop identified the community's goals, and the second tested or confirmed those goals and also laid out recommendations to implement those goals. And the outcome of all of this public engagement was a tailored plan for each area that lays out its specific goals and recommendations. Each planning area is different and it responds to what we heard from those individual communities. But as you'll see in the slides I'm getting ready to cover, there were a lot of commonalities across each small area. So getting started with the junction, the major theme here is about mobility, really rationalizing the road network in this neighborhood to improve conditions for pedestrians and cyclists, as well as drivers. As I mentioned earlier, it also includes recommendations about revising one of the redevelopment plan areas in this neighborhood, the Morris Canal redevelopment plan, and also designating Bergen Hill as a local historic district. Looking at the goals for the junction, I'm not going to read these individually, but the first one is revitalization, which really speaks to promoting development that addresses vacant and underutilized areas. We heard a lot about essential services, which are much needed local services, goods and services that the community has identified as a key need. Again, multimodal mobility was a major theme, and the need to improve safety and functionality in the junction. And then the local environment is something we heard a lot about, issues of cleanliness and attractiveness of the public realm. So there are specific recommendations for each of these areas. For the West Side Avenue, some of the key themes that we heard here were looking at streetscape and building facade improvements along the West Side Avenue corridor itself, as well as increasing multi-mobility options throughout the neighborhood, and activating the light rail station area through the creation of a town square park with new mixed-use development. Moving to the goals for West Side Avenue, again, you'll see some overlap here. We heard many of the same themes across neighborhoods. Here, I think the priority goal was essential services, the need to increase availability of neighborhood goods and services, especially grocery stores, as well as provide a multi-generational community center. That's something that we heard really desired by the community. For revitalization, there's a need to support new infill development, but also to maintain the scale of the interior blocks and promote adaptive reuse and rehab over demolition. Again, we heard issues with the local environment on cleanliness and aesthetics of the public realm, and also a desire for new or improved open spaces. And on multimodal mobility, again, we heard a desire for more options and expanded access, as well as needs for maintenance and improved lighting in the neighborhood. So the final small area plan that the land use element looks at is the Lower Heights area. And here, one of the key themes we heard was the need to green the neighborhood and expand open space, public open space. We heard a lot about the R1 zoning district, which really dovetailed with what we were looking at on a citywide level, and the need to amend the R1 zoning was an issue of great concern to this neighborhood. Another theme is helping homeowners maintain and upgrade their buildings and improving Route 139, as well as major north-south corridors like Baldwin, Summit, and Palisade Avenues. So in terms of the goals for Lower Heights, many of them, again, are similar to some of the other neighborhoods, but slightly different as well. The key priority here was multimodal mobility and the need to improve pedestrian and bike access, both within the Lower Heights and also connection to surrounding areas. And there was identified a need to leverage assets like the Bergen Arches and the Palisades to create new links to transportation to other areas. On the local environment, there were concerns raised again about cleanliness and attractiveness of the public realm, and also the need to bury utility lines and create new open space. And this is a neighborhood that was very concerned about development pressures and the need to maintain its existing scale. So the small area vision plan speaks a great deal to balancing investment with the preservation of the existing context and also affordable housing. With that, I'm going to turn it over to city staff to facilitate questions and comments from the board as well as members of the public. Thank you very much for your time tonight.